A debt was to be paid not in coin or cattle, but in the currency of a soul, a transaction sealed under a sky the color of rust and old regret. On the blanched plains where the wind spoke only of erosion and endings, Silas lived within the architecture of his own grief. His heart was a locked room, the key long lost in the same earth that had claimed his wife, Maria, and with her, every flower, every song, every reason for the sun to rise. His ranch was a portrait of this internal desolation. Fences leaned like tired old men, the barn door hung agape like a silent scream, and the dust, a fine red powder, coated everything, a shroud over a life that had ceased to live and was merely, stubbornly, existing. Mornings were a ritual of bitter coffee and the vast, accusatory silence of the prairie. He moved through his chores with the grim efficiency of a man who works only to exhaust the body so the mind cannot wander. The children in the distant, dusty town, the only settlement for 100 miles, spoke of him in hushed tones, their parents pointing to his silhouette against the horizon as a cautionary tale, a man hollowed out by sorrow. In the center of his property sat the most potent symbol of his decay, a square of earth, fenced off and barren, where Maria's garden had once blazed with color. Now, it was a graveyard of withered stalks and cracked soil, a testament to the fact that nothing beautiful could survive here. Not anymore. The arrival of Jedediah Barlow was like the scrape of a steel spur on raw nerve. Barlow was a man carved from greed and impatience, a land baron who owned the paper on Silas's ranch and, by extension, the remainder of Silas's life. He rode a horse too fine for the landscape, his leather jacket gleaming with an offensive newness. He did not dismount, a deliberate posture of superiority, forcing Silas to look up at him from the porch steps. The laughter that followed his greeting was like stones grinding together. "Heard you've been lonely out here, Silas," Barlow drawled, a cruel glint in his eyes. "A man needs companionship." A woman's touch. Silas said nothing, his face a mask of stone, his gaze fixed on the horizon beyond Barlow's shoulder. He knew this was not about kindness. Barlow's kindness was a myth, a tool he used only to twist the knife later. From behind the swell of the hill, 2 of Barlow's men led a wagon forward. In the back, sitting on a crude bench, was the payment for Silas's debt. A woman. But as she was made to stand, a collective gasp seemed to be stolen from the very air. She was a giantess, a creature of impossible scale, her head nearly brushing the canvas roof of the wagon. Her frame was immense, broad-shouldered and long-limbed, her presence so overwhelming it seemed to warp the landscape around her. The whispers of Barlow's men were audible, snickering and foul. "A bride for the broken man," Barlow announced, his voice booming with malicious glee. "She's all yours, Silas." Debts paid, the woman was prodded forward. She moved not with the clumsiness one might expect, but with a slow, burdened dignity, her eyes downcast. She was dressed in rough burlap, a garment meant to humiliate, to emphasize her status as chattel. This was the joke, the punchline to Silas's tragedy, to give the man who had lost everything a monstrous caricature of what he had lost. Silas felt a tremor of rage, a deep, primal fury that was almost unfamiliar. But it was quickly suffocated by the cold weight of his powerlessness. He was trapped. Barlow and his men rode away, their laughter echoing back, a final act of desecration on the quiet air. Silas was left standing there, a silent man facing a silent giant, under an unforgiving sun. The house, small and weathered even for a man of normal stature, seemed to shrink in her presence. Silas, standing in the doorway, felt an absurd impulse to apologize for its meagerness. He gestured numbly toward the spare room at the back, a space that had been empty for years, accumulating only dust and memories too painful to disturb. She had to duck her head significantly to pass through the threshold. The door closed behind her with a soft click, and the silence that descended was heavier than before, charged with the presence of this enormous, unknown other. That first night, sleep was a stranger to him. He sat in his worn armchair, the cold hearth before him, and listened. He expected heavy footfalls, the sounds of a large body struggling in a small space. Instead, there was a profound quiet, a stillness so complete it was unnerving. He was an observer in his own home, a jailer to a prisoner he hadn't asked for. Peering through a crack in his own bedroom door, he could see a sliver of her room, lit by the stark moonlight pouring through the single window. She was not sleeping. She was sitting on the edge of the small cot, which looked like a child's bed beneath her, her back ramrod straight. Her posture was not one of defiance, but of immense, contained sorrow. Her large hands rested on her knees, perfectly still. In that moment, framed by the moonlight, her scale seemed less monstrous and more tragic, as if she were a monument to some forgotten grief. The next morning, from the grimy kitchen window, he watched as the town children, drawn by the gossip that had surely spread like wildfire, crept toward the edge of his property. They hid behind the gnarled mesquite trees, their small faces a mixture of terror and uncontainable curiosity, pointing and whispering at the house that now held a giant. She was a myth made real, a sideshow spectacle dropped into their mundane world. Silas felt a flicker of something akin to pity, a shared sense of being an object of scrutiny and speculation. The days that followed were a silent ballet of avoidance and observation. They moved around each other in the confined space of the house like two celestial bodies held in a reluctant orbit, their gravity felt but their surfaces never touching. Words were an abandoned currency. His communication was limited to leaving a plate of bland, nourishing food on the kitchen table before he left for his chores, and finding the plate washed and returned to the shelf when he came back. There were no thanks, no acknowledgements. It was a transaction, as sterile and necessary as watering livestock. He began to notice things. Her hands, which he had expected to be clumsy and powerful, were surprisingly deft. He watched, unseen, as she took one of his torn work shirts from the mending pile. He'd intended to throw it out. With a needle and thread she must have carried with her, she began to stitch the ragged tear. Her fingers, though large, moved with a surgeon's precision. The resulting seam was a marvel of fine, even stitches, stronger and neater than the original. It was an act of restoration, a small, quiet defiance of the decay that surrounded them. One afternoon, he saw her standing before the dead garden. She stood there for a long time, her immense form casting a long shadow over the barren earth. He felt a sharp, protective pang, a surge of the old, familiar pain. That ground was sacred. It was a memorial. He wanted to storm out, to yell, to tell her to look away, that she had no right to even cast her shadow there. But the stillness in her posture held him back. She was not looking with pity or morbid curiosity. It was a look he couldn't decipher, something deep and contemplative, as if she were listening to the soil's memory. That evening, he left a slightly larger portion of stew on the table, with a piece of cornbread beside it. It was a gesture so small as to be almost meaningless, yet in the profound silence of their world, it felt like a shout. She started on the garden the next morning. There was no request for permission, no discussion. He came out onto the porch, his coffee cup warm in his hands, and saw her there, on her knees in the dirt. She was pulling the dead, brittle stalks of Maria's roses from the ground. A cold fury rose in Silas's throat. Each weed she pulled felt like a violation, an erasure of the last tangible piece of his wife he had left. His knuckles were white where he gripped the porch railing. He opened his mouth to shout, to command her to stop, to get away from that hallowed ground. The word died on his lips. He watched her work. She was not ripping the dead things from the earth with violence. Her movements were methodical, almost reverent. She cleared the choking weeds with a patient, steady hand, piling them neatly to one side. She seemed to be freeing the soil, not desecrating it. He stayed on the porch for over an hour, a silent, conflicted sentry, watching as she single-handedly cleared the plot that had been his monument to loss. The sun beat down on her broad back, and she did not falter. The children at the fence line had grown bolder. They no longer hid. They stood in a small, silent cluster, their fear having slowly transmuted into a quiet awe. They were watching a landscape they had only ever known as dead being tended to. They were witnessing an act of creation, and it was mesmerizing. Silas retreated back into the house, the anger within him warring with a strange, unsettling flicker of hope. He was watching her dismantle his memorial, and he was letting her. The locked room of his heart rattled, just slightly, on its rusted hinges. A change was coming, it was in the air. The sky to the west had bruised to a deep purple, and the wind had begun to whisper warnings, kicking up small cyclones of red dust. The atmosphere grew thick and heavy, mirroring the unspoken tension that had been building on the ranch for weeks. The woman, he still didn't have a name for her, thinking of her only as her, had finished clearing the garden. The soil was dark and exposed, a blank canvas where before there had been only a ruin. That evening, as he went to latch his bedroom window against the coming storm, he found it. Resting on the weathered sill was a small, perfectly smooth river stone, grey and cool to the touch. It was an object of simple, unadorned beauty. He picked it up. It felt heavy in his palm, weighted with an intention he could not parse. Was it a peace offering? A token of thanks for the food? Or something else entirely? He closed his fingers around it, the stone's coolness a stark contrast to the turbulent heat in his own chest, and slipped it into his pocket. The storm broke just after midnight. It was a deluge, a violent catharsis for the parched land. Rain hammered against the tin roof, and thunder cracked with a percussive force that shook the very foundations of the small house. He couldn't sleep. Drawn by an instinct he didn't examine, he moved into the main room. And there she was. She was standing before the large window, a colossal silhouette against the violent, strobing flashes of lightning. The storm raged outside, but she was an island of absolute stillness within it. She was not afraid. She was watching it, witnessing its power. And in that moment, as a bolt of lightning illuminated her face, he saw not a giant, not a monster, not the punchline to a cruel joke. He saw a person. A person who understood what it was to endure a storm, to stand firm while the world tore itself apart around you. A profound and unexpected kinship resonated within him, as silent and powerful as the lightning that lit up the sky. The day after the storm, the world felt scrubbed clean. The air was crisp, and the scent of wet earth was a perfume of renewal. In the garden, the change was startling. The dark, tilled soil had drunk deeply of the rain, and already, almost imperceptibly, a few defiant specks of green were pushing their way toward the sun. They were nothing more than tiny sprouts, fragile and tenacious, yet they felt like a miracle. The children noticed it, too. Later that day, Silas saw a small, clumsy bouquet of wildflowers lying just inside the fence near the garden plot, a timid offering left for the giant who made things grow. A fragile bridge was being built, one wildflower at a time, between the town's fear and this strange new reality. The peace, however, was as fragile as those first green shoots. The sight of Barlow's fine horse cresting the hill was an immediate and visceral violation. He rode directly to the house, his presence casting a pall over the morning. He dismounted with an arrogant swagger, his gaze sweeping over the property with an owner's possessiveness. Then his eyes landed on her, where she stood near the nascent garden, her hands covered in rich soil. A contemptuous sneer twisted his lips. He ignored her completely, addressing Silas as if she were a piece of furniture or a stray animal. "Well, well, Silas," he said, his voice slick with insinuation. "Looks like you're putting my property to good use." Didn't figure her for a farmhand, he took a step closer to her, his eyes raking over her form with a blatant, dehumanizing appraisal. The air grew still and sharp, like the moment before a blade falls. Silas felt the blood drain from his face, replaced by a cold, rising tide of fury. The protector within him, dormant for so long it was almost a ghost, began to stir from its slumber. His hands, resting at his sides, slowly, deliberately, clenched into fists. Barlow, drunk on his own power, took another step. He laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Time to see if the merchandise is holding up," he sneered, reaching out a hand to grab her arm, to assert his claim, his ownership, in the most physical and degrading way possible. He expected her to flinch, to cower, to endure it as she was supposed to. He was wrong. Before Silas's rage could translate into motion, she moved. It was not a violent act. It was a fluid, almost elegant shift of her weight, a simple sidestep that possessed a grace utterly shocking in a person of her size. Barlow's grasping hand met only empty air, his momentum carrying him forward into a clumsy, humiliating stumble. He caught himself before he fell, his face flushing a dark, mottled red. Humiliation curdled instantly into venomous rage. The mask of cruel amusement fell away, revealing the raw ugliness beneath. With a guttural snarl, he reached to the coiled bullwhip on his saddle. "You insolent beast," he spat, his voice thick with hate. "I'll teach you your place." He tore the whip free. That was the moment the dam inside Silas broke. The grief, the shame, the powerlessness that had held him captive for years were washed away in a singular, cleansing flood of protective instinct. He moved without thinking, crossing the space between them in 2 long strides. He planted himself directly between Barlow and the woman, his back to her, his body a living shield. The world seemed to fall silent, waiting. And into that silence, Silas's voice, rough from disuse but charged with a deadly calm, dropped like a stone. "Get off my land!" Barlow stopped, whip in hand, genuinely surprised. Then he laughed again, a sound of pure disbelief and ridicule. "Your land," he mocked. "You forget yourself, Silas. This is my land." Barlow's arm tensed, the whip rising, a black snake poised to strike. The air crackled. The children at the fence held their breath, their eyes wide with terror. It was in this frozen, critical moment, as violence was about to be unleashed, that the great silence was finally broken by a voice other than the men's. It was not the booming, monstrous sound Silas might have imagined. It was a voice as deep and clear as a cello, resonant with a quiet power that cut through the tension like a blade. "His name is Silas," she said. Her first words. She did not shout. She spoke them calmly, directly at Barlow, an act of profound defiance. Then, her gaze shifted for a fraction of a second to meet Silas's, and she added, "And my name is Ilara." The declaration of their names, spoken aloud in that charged space, was more powerful than any blow. It was an assertion of self, a claiming of identity for them both. It transformed them from a broken man and a nameless giant into Silas and Ilara. The shock of it struck Barlow with a palpable force. He faltered, the whip held aloft, his entire posture thrown off balance by this sudden, irrefutable evidence of her humanity. He looked from her dignified face to the expression in Silas's eyes. He no longer saw the beaten-down debtor he had come to torment. He saw a man fully awakened, a protector whose gaze promised not a fight he might win, but a war he could not possibly survive. The fury in Silas's eyes was absolute. Barlow, for all his cruelty, was a pragmatist. He saw the shift. The joke was over. He lowered the whip, his face a mask of thwarted rage. With a final, contemptuous spit onto the ground near Silas's feet, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away, defeated not by strength, but by a dignity he could never comprehend. In the ringing silence that followed Barlow's departure, the dust began to settle, both literally and figuratively. The world seemed to rush back in, the buzz of a fly, the distant call of a hawk, the soft sigh of the wind through the newly planted garden. Silas slowly turned, his body still thrumming with an adrenaline he hadn't felt in years. He looked at Ilara, but this time, he truly saw her. The caricature was gone. The giant, the cruel joke, the payment for a debt, all of it had dissolved in the calm resonance of her voice. He saw not her size, but her stature. He saw the quiet strength that had endured unspeakable hardship, the grace that had mended his shirt, the hope that had tilled his dead soil. He saw the resilient survivor who had just, with 2 simple sentences, given him back his own name. He looked from her face to the small patch of green shoots pushing through the dark, damp earth, a fragile promise of life. Then his gaze returned to hers. There were no words. None were needed. He simply gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was a gesture that carried the weight of an apology, of gratitude, of respect. It was the beginning of a new language between them. The narrative of their lives slowed, finding a new, gentle rhythm. They worked. Sometimes side by side in the garden, which grew and flourished under their combined care. Sometimes in their own spheres, he mending fences that were no longer tired, she turning the small house into a place of quiet order. Their communication remained one of actions, a tool left where it was needed, a bucket of fresh water drawn and waiting, a shared meal on the porch, watching the sun set in a blaze of defiant color. Their shared silence was no longer heavy with grief and uncertainty, but comfortable, full of unspoken understanding. They were two solitary souls who, in shielding each other, had found a way to heal themselves. If this story moved you, remember that true stature is not measured by the space a body occupies in the world, but by the dignity with which a soul inhabits its life. Worth is not a thing that can be given or taken by the cruel jests of others, it is an intrinsic truth, waiting to be recognized. True connection is rarely found in loud declarations or grand promises. It is forged in the quiet spaces, in the silent acts of seeing another's pain and offering shelter, in the shared labor of tending to a barren patch of ground, believing that something beautiful can still grow. It is in the courage to speak a name, and the grace to hear it. Look for the silent helpers, the quiet protectors, the resilient survivors. Be one. For in the simple, profound act of recognizing another's humanity, we may just find our own.